The WWE Women's War Games match at Survivor Series got a little bit more interesting on this week's edition of WWE Raw, as it was Bayley assisting Bianca Belair in the advantage match to give Bianca Belair's team the advantage heading into that match against Nia Jax, Tiffany Stratton, Candice LeRae, Liv Morgan, and Raquel Rodriguez. And so that sets up quite an intriguing spin on things, knowing the history between Bayley and Bianca. But we'll get into that as well as everything else that happened on this week's edition of Raw. Not the most star power, I would say, for this go-home edition of Raw heading into War Games, but as we know, a lot of it was still going to be coming off of the heels of one of the biggest segments of the year in WWE, if not the biggest, when you look at the social media views and everything that they were pushing. Over 72 million, I think they said, for CM Punk's return with Paul Heyman on SmackDown. So not a lot of star power on this week's Raw. You didn't have anything really with the Bloodline of substance. There were a couple things that I will mention here, but other than that, a lot of it sort of shifting towards the Women's War Games match, and we had some new additions to the card that we'll discuss as well. But let's start with the main event, as it was Bianca getting the win over Nia Jax. I know some people probably looking at Nia Jax right now thinking, man, the women's champion, WWE Women's Champion, that is, has been pinned a few times since she won that championship. But, you know, one of them, of course, came at Crown Jewel against Liv Morgan for the Crown Jewel title. Now you have a scenario here where Bayley assists Bianca, which you would think, you know, can set up kind of matches in the future for Nia if she's not cashed in on before then, which we'll talk about that in the Survivor Series prediction video this week. But, you know, this was something where if you check the spoilers for SmackDown, you know that Jade Cargill has to be replaced, right? Based on what we saw last week on SmackDown. If you've already read the spoilers for this upcoming SmackDown, which was taped last week, you know who the fifth member is going to be. And they certainly led you in the direction on this particular show that it would be Bayley, based on her assisting Bianca. Bianca gives her, you know, sort of the look, seems pleased at Bayley interfering in this match and helping her get the advantage for the team that is going to consist of Bianca, Rhea Ripley, Naomi, and Io Sky. And so then, again, now we wait to see who the fifth member is officially going to be once that's announced. But we know this is kind of, again, sort of an unexpected twist because of everything that has happened in the past between Bianca and Bayley. Bianca's made it clear that she, you know, in any scenario, even when Bayley has become, you know, the cheered babyface and all this again, there is still that tension between them. And so this helps lower some of that tension, right? But of course, you also have to ask the question, are there hidden motivations here when it comes to what Bayley is trying to achieve? Because you remember, last week we did start to talk about, you know, the Jade Cargill attack. Who are the people that could possibly somehow be behind this? And we didn't really go into any of the specifics yet, but when you start to think about it, I'm sure you guys have seen it online and everything about all the different possibilities there could be. There are some names that keep popping up, right? We did quickly mention the actual Bianca Belair theory of how could she have been the one that attacked Jade. Doesn't really make a lot of sense, you would think, if Jade saw who did it, which that we don't really know, right? You're going to assume that maybe Jade doesn't know who attacked her. And so Bianca was immediately kind of the first person that people pointed to because, well, we know that breakup's going to happen at some point in the future. It's just a matter of, is this what causes us to get there? Another name that was kind of mentioned was, you know, Charlotte Flair, right? She's still out there. The possibility of her return. Could she come back? And look, it was Charlotte scheming once again to get herself in a position where she takes out Jade. You're going to start a rivalry between those two that culminates somewhere down the line. You know, whether that's in the Royal Rumble, whether it's at WrestleMania 41, lots of different options. But then you could also look at Bayley here and wonder, is Bayley the person who is trying to somehow put this rift between Bianca and Jade, and maybe there are some things that start to point in Bianca's direction, and Jade doesn't remember who attacked her. However they decide to go about this. We know they did announce on the show that there is no timetable for Jade's return. But if they start to plant that idea, that people start saying, well, you know, what if it was Bianca? And you start to see, you know, some of those little red herrings that come up where, oh man, Bianca looks guilty. These kind of things, right? You could see that as a possibility. And what if? What if it's Bayley going back to the dark side of being a heel again and being someone who somehow decided to attack Jade to get into this match, and now Bianca has let her guard down, right? Because Bayley helped her, and so on the surface, it seems pretty clear. And if you remember, too, who were the two people we saw in the back, right? When they're loading up the ambulance to take Jade Cargill, Bianca goes with her. Nick Aldis was one of them, but we also know that Bayley and Naomi were the two women's stars who were there. And so could we turn our attention to one of those two? Was it Bayley? Was it Naomi? All of these different things. And so I like kind of the discourse going on right now because there are a lot of different theories out there as to who this could be. But I still think, you're probably looking at one of those options right there. It doesn't seem like anyone else out of the blue would be, one that makes a lot of sense. But if you start to kind of combine some of the things together, maybe this is something where either the fingers start to point towards Bayley, they start to point towards Bianca, and maybe, that's exactly who the person that attacked Jade wants it to be, right? They want the fingers pointing towards one of those two. So I'm curious to see how this plays out. We know WWE likes to do more of these kind of mysterious sort of attacks and these kind of things, and then have the big reveal. They've clearly planned this out from the beginning. They already know who did it. This isn't back in the day where, we got the anonymous Raw GM, where we never know who's going to be revealed as the anonymous GM until eventually we do. But it's all those things, right? You finally kind of have a scenario here where I think this is planned out from the beginning, and who attacked Jade. I still want to know your thoughts. I know some of you guys weighed in on the comments on SmackDown, but let me know if you think that this furthered your sort of evidence towards someone in particular on this show. But it does seem like Bayley will be the person added as the fifth member for that team, which would mean Bayley is in yet another War Games match. She's not going to be left out this year, and somehow I'm betting that plays into the story as we move forward. So War Games advantage goes to the baby faces, which is, again, not something that is that usual. You'd like to give the heels the advantage in those kind of things, which I would think if you're going to give the baby face the advantage in this particular women's match, surely the heels will probably have the advantage on the men's side. But we'll see how that plays out in SmackDown when Jey Uso and Jacob Fatu go one-on-one there. But we'll stick with the women's theme here before we get into a couple things on the men's side with that particular men's War Games match. There were a couple things that were mentioned here that I think are notable. But the Women's Intercontinental Championship announced officially, actually before the show, but it was announced going into, sort of towards the end of the show as well, that Adam Pearce did make it official. There is going to be a new Women's Intercontinental Championship. Now, if you remember at the start, when they announced the Women's United States title, they initially said, this was going to be a title, that could be basically defended across both brands, which, maybe that is still the case based on how they're going to either do or not do this brand split once the Netflix era begins in January. Because like I said, you're going to want to really load up all your top talent on Raw, on Netflix to get that thing off the, get going off the bat with some big numbers and those kind of things. But they are introducing the Women's Intercontinental Championship. And, I know there's a theory out there that, a lot of belts sometimes can sort of, water it all down, right? You can have too many belts and those kind of things. And there is particular belt on this show that we're going to talk about that if you don't utilize all the belts to their best extent, why add another one? But I do think this is a state, and I will say this as someone now who I told you guys over the past couple weeks, I've gone back and I've really started to go back into the NXT archives here. And by archives, I mean really the past several months of NXT. I'm going through show by show, catching up on NXT because you guys know, sometimes I jump in on NXT, I jump out, haven't done any videos on the channel with NXT. But as I am catching up on NXT, and I'm almost there, like we're actually going to start doing some NXT videos very soon because I'm almost all the way back into real time of catching up. But I'm telling you, the women's division they have in NXT, I can see why they're adding another championship because it's not just what they have on the main roster. It's the people they're going to want to call up very, very soon and put them on the main roster into this rotation because there are a lot of talented people on that NXT women's roster right now in terms of the star power and the potential that is there. And so I think this is one of those necessary moves where if you are going to try to keep this brand split in some way, shape, or form, even if you have people that bounce back and forth a little bit, if you kind of keep, your regular rotation on each brand, having two of these mid-card women's titles, as long as you can make them feel a little bit different, right? Make sure it's not the same. The stories have to be different in those things. You have to find a way to differentiate them a little bit. But again, that's going to all come down to who is the champion and, who are the challengers, because that's going to be your story as you go into booking each of these titles. But I think this is something where it's a big opportunity to keep kind of pushing the women's division forward. You've got, again, a lot of women on this card that we said, right? Look how many people have actually been in the Women's World Championship picture this year on Raw. I mean, think about it, right? And even if just this year, take this second half of the year. It's been Liv Morgan, it's been Rhea Ripley. And that is pretty much it, right? Yeah, Io Sky, going to get the opportunity and those kind of things, but it's been dominated by two people. And so, if you're going to have these longer-term stories, the way they've done it with Liv Morgan and Rhea Ripley, I can understand why they're going to add another championship into the mix so that they can be able to have more, opportunities to get more people rotating in for championship potential that aren't going to be at the world title level, right? And so I don't think it's the worst idea at all. But, you don't want to just create a championship to create a championship. But like I said, I do feel at least a little more confident where they haven't hit on everything in the Triple H era in terms of they're not swinging 100% here, right? They're not batting 1,000. There have been a couple misses along the way in terms of how they book certain titles. And we're going to get to one of them in just a minute. But I think for now, you're not going to create this championship unless you have a pretty strong idea of where you want to go and have a feeling that this women's roster and the depth on it right now is pretty tremendous, not just at the main roster level, but as you go deeper into NXT and all that. I mean, there are multiple, probably more than a handful of people on the NXT women's roster right now that could be called up next week, and they'd be just fine fitting into, the way that they're doing things on the main roster. So I have to believe, that is one of the reasons why they're doing this, knowing the depth they have. And so curious to see what happens. They'll start the tournament next week for the Women's Intercontinental Championship. But beyond that, speaking of championships, going in kind of a random order here, but, to tie it into the tag team championships, right? You had Finn Balor and JD McDonagh defending their championships. Yes, it actually happened on this week's edition of WWE Raw as they defended their titles against the War Raiders, and Balor and JD retain. So another successful title defense. That's not many now, but it is a successful title defense as Dominic and Carlito get involved here. Wasn't sure if they would kind of pull the switch here on the, swapping the titles at this spot, but clearly they have more of a plan on where they want to go with the next champions, and assuming that's not going to be the War Raiders, I think it's going to be interesting to see what they do next, because, the Judgment Day thing, we're kind of back to that. You're kind of teasing a little bit of that tension still with Finn and Dominic and those kind of things. So, could you have a scenario where Finn and JD are somehow teaming up against Dominic and Carlito in some kind of scenario? I don't really know exactly how it plays out from here, but, they're clearly building up something here to keep the titles on Finn and JD for now until they have a better, better picture of where they want to go with the next challengers. But speaking of the Judgment Day, again, they are kind of playing up still that tension there, and Balor kind of bringing up, hey, everything's fine when everyone listens to me. And we know that's never a good thing when a leader says that. And so you would expect something's coming here, and there's going to be a big development sooner rather than later. And you've started to see maybe things turn a little bit with Dominic. So what are they going to do there? Finn kind of, placing some of the blame on Dominic for losing in that fatal four-way match to get a shot at the world title. He and Carlito lose a tag team match. So they're planting those seeds again for something to happen here with Judgment Day. And we'll just, again, wait and see what they're going to do next. And I really want to know what they're going to do next with these tag team championships. But beyond that, let's get back to one thing in particular before we kind of wrap up with some other kind of quick hitters here. Because, again, I just didn't think you had a lot of huge developments on this particular show, but a couple other things I think that are notable. Of course, the New Day thing that took place with Kofi Kingston and Xavier Woods losing in surprise fashion to Alpha Academy. But it was all about the post-match, as you did have, kind of a miscommunication to start the match where Kofi wants to start, Xavier Woods immediately tags himself in. That leads to shenanigans, them getting taken out, and they lose the match, right? But then they have a really fierce and tense exchange backstage afterwards. Each other kind of finally airing all their grievances with the other, and letting all the frustrations out. All this time it's been building up for months and months and months, right? It's finally all let out with Xavier Woods telling Kofi that he's the reason he became the champion, bringing up the 6-second loss to Brock Lesnar on SmackDown. The infamous match there. Kofi bringing up the fact that he and Big E never let Xavier Woods call the shots because he takes too many unnecessary risks, and there's a reason why Xavier's never been a singles champion. And so these two really, going with the low blows here, right at each other, and they do it, of course, a week before the big 10-year anniversary for the New Day, and I think it still sets up the way we've been talking about it when we talked a little bit more about it a while back. This has to be that big moment where you get these two in the ring. It's the big anniversary. All of a sudden, you think everything's fine, then things aren't fine after the match, and now You have to have somebody bring them back together. This is where you can have the big return of Big E himself, not in a wrestling capacity, but just to have Big E associated with these two again on screen is going to lead us in some kind of direction here. I don't know if it's as easy as Big E comes in and everybody's happy again and we go on like nothing ever happened. I don't know that that's going to happen. But I do think this is kind of built around the return of Big E. He's the only person that can bring these two back together, at least for this anniversary. But what's going to happen there? Do you have this big, kind of moment with Xavier Woods finally getting his, shining moment to be able to do something here that catapults him into being a singles star, right? I don't want to mention it, like, who knows? Does he attack Big E? Does he do something like that? I don't think that's going to happen. But, if you do want to do something very intense here, there are possibilities as to who does something that leads us into a new direction now for the New Day. And again, I don't know that it's as simple as, I know some people think it's just going to be Big E coming back and reuniting them. I don't know about that. I think it would probably be more interesting to have these two go in their separate directions. But we'll see, right? Because, it's a very crowded roster, and if you do that, there's always the chance that, you're not exactly in that same scenario. But you could reunite them, and they could win the tag team championships, right? So there are ways you can go with this, but I like the backstage segment here with these two finally airing everything out, and you know exactly the way they feel, right, about where they stand heading into what should be, I think, a must-see segment next week with this anniversary. So elsewhere on this show, you did have a couple things mentioned by Sami Zayn and Jimmy Uso that caught my attention. Very little Bloodline presence on the show. You had a video with Solo basically just taking aim at Roman Reigns for bringing in CM Punk, Paul Heyman back, hyping up Jay versus Fatu on SmackDown. But the question was asked here, I think it was by Kathy Kelly, to Sami Zayn about whether they can trust CM Punk, right? And Zayn's like, I just don't know. Like, it's a very complicated history, and we are going to get the one-on-one, face-to-face with Punk and Roman on SmackDown to talk through their differences, I guess is kind of the way they're setting up. But, you had Zayn saying, I don't know if we can trust Punk just yet. But there's something that Jimmy said immediately after that really should raise interest, I think. And that is, Jimmy's like, hey, of course we can trust Punk, right? The wise man said we could trust. It was cool to trust him, so we can trust him. That just kind of like, I don't know about that, Jimmy. Like, I don't know if you said that, and all of a sudden you got my attention because you're saying that the only reason you can trust Punk is because Paul Heyman said it was okay to trust Punk, and so I know there are people with a lot of kind of looks at what Paul Heyman did on SmackDown, what he was wearing, and those things that we mentioned on the SmackDown reaction show, but I think it is something where the more you kind of look at this, they do always drop those little bitty tiny details. And I think Jimmy's saying something just as simple as, Heyman said we could trust Punk, everything's going to be fine. Not necessarily to say that Punk's going to turn on them, which I don't think is going to happen at all, but to kind of validate Paul Heyman always saying something that you can trust. And we just know that's not the case. So I'm not sure why Jimmy believes that. He may believe it in the short term, may work out fine for him at Survivor Series, but beyond that, I think we've got some interesting things to figure out with what Paul Heyman's next move could be on his particular chessboard, because we know Paul Heyman's always playing chess when everyone else is playing checkers. So we'll see what Heyman has in store here moving forward. But elsewhere on this week's show, we haven't really mentioned Gunther and Damian Priest because I just don't know that this has probably been the kind of build that I would have expected necessarily for this big World Heavyweight Championship match. Speaking of which, we did get the card kind of filled out here, and we'll get to the other thing in a second. Like, we kind of know what the matches are going to be now. LA Knight versus Shinsuke Nakamura. If the United States Championship match is added, we'll get to the triple threat Intercontinental title match in just a second. But, this is your World Heavyweight Championship match. Like, this is your next big match other than the War Games ones at Survivor Series. But, you had the face-to-face here. The thought is still that Gunther is sort of doubting himself. Priest brings up the fact that, is the pressure gotten to Gunther? He doesn't have that aura the way he did before. But since he's won the title, Priest is bringing up, has that gotten to him? Has that pressure, that confidence, has it been taking a hit a bit? So that's kind of the story here. And they haven't really gone maybe in too much detail. This is a rematch. I get it. But, I don't really... There's nothing right now that makes me believe that Damian Priest is actually, has a great chance to win this championship from Gunther, other than the fact that it's just playing on the confidence issues of Gunther. And seeing how well established those are, I think we'll see, again, how this match plays out. But this feels like, at least the way it's set up, like this is just another sort of Gunther title defense here. Don't really see Priest in a scenario where he gets the title back. We'll go more into that in our Survivor Series predictions this week. But for now, I just thought this was pretty, simple stuff to kind of just continue to push that idea. The Priest is trying to shake the confidence of Gunther, and maybe, that's kind of where things stand as we head into this. And of course, Priest sends him with a razor's edge through the table too. So, Priest kind of showing that he'll do anything to get that championship back, standing tall over Gunther. And so maybe that shakes the confidence a little more heading into this big world title defense. Speaking of title defenses, it's going to be Bron Breakker defending the Intercontinental Championship against Sheamus and Ludwig Kaiser now, based on the fact that the match between Breakker and Kaiser was broken up here by Sheamus. And then you just had that unbelievable spot where Breakker just steamrolls around the ring and just goes shoulder first. He may have went, I don't know what else he went first into the announce table, but that was brutal looking. Not sure how he was okay after that, but he was. But again, having Sheamus and Kaiser continuing their long-standing feud, adding it into the Intercontinental Championship picture here, I think is fine. So should be a good match. We'll talk about it on the Survivor Series predictions and give more thoughts on that in particular. But again, the only other, I think, notable stuff you got on this particular show, as we look at it here, you did have, the Creeds kind of stealing a win here from Rey Mysterio and Dragon Lee after Chad Gable put the mask over Rey's face. And, the other thing you did get kind of the development with the Wyatt Six stuff, The Miz telling the Final Testament they were out there, and so they went to look for him. But then, of course, it's Nikki Cross attacking Scarlett in the locker room. So you did get that as well. That was, again, kind of your setup here as we head into the go-home edition of SmackDown for Survivor Series. But those were kind of your bigger things on this particular show. So you guys let me know your thought on this particular edition of Raw. What did you think of these storyline developments? And again, what are your kind of thoughts on some of these things, especially the Bianca Bayley stuff as we move forward and how that plays into who attacked Jade Cargill? And what are your thoughts on Gunther and Damian Priest? How do you kind of feel this build has been leading into this World Heavyweight Championship match and all of that at Survivor Series, and anything else you want to discuss? As always, let me know, guys, in the comments. Always appreciate your feedback. Hit that subscribe button. Hit the like button on your way out. Again, Survivor Series predictions coming this week. Again, I appreciate you watching, as always, and let me know your thoughts on this week's edition of WWE Raw.